Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the day. Welcome to What We Grew and What We Grow, U.S. Gardening History, 1860. And I'm Kristen Eggen, the Seed Savers Exchange Gift Officer, and I'll be your host for this session. Thank you to Organic Valley for sponsoring this session. Before we start, we will review the community agreements for the conference. We ask that all participants in the Seed the Future, Grow Something Good conference is respectful. We encourage you to be curious, be patient, speak from your own experiences, try to avoid jargon, be conscious of intent versus impact, take space or make space for others, and most of all, take care of yourself. We're here today with Craig LeHoullier. Welcome, Craig.
Hi, hello, Kristen, and hello, everyone.
Hi there. Thank you for being here. Craig LeHoullier is a longtime Seed Savers Exchange member and author of Epic Tomatoes and Growing Vegetables and Straw Bales, as well as the leader of the Dwarf Tomato Breeding Project. He holds storytelling, education, and growing the gardening community amongst his life's top priorities. Today, Craig will be looking at a variety of crops at 50-year intervals through pages from seed catalogs. Craig will reveal which types of crops ebbed and flowed in popularity, the impact of hybrids, and the resurgence of open-pollinated varieties, which we are in the midst of today. Craig, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. It is an absolute pleasure. I want to thank you, Kristen, Gabe, who I just met, Janine, who I have spoken with often, and really all of you for attending and for the Seed Savers Exchange for the amazing impact that it's had on my and all of our lives. So we're going to see if we can make this work now. And if all goes well, you will be seeing my slides. Here we go. So the intervals we're going to take are going to be roughly at 50 years, starting with the mid-1800s, and I'll show why that is. But this is a talk that I love to give, and I've been asked to give it infrequently just because everybody wants to hear about tomatoes. That seems to be the niche that I've found myself in. But I think this talk really positions the relevance of the Seed Savers Exchange in the gardening story of the United States, if not the world. So we're going to start just by looking at some gardens, and maybe you could picture yourself in your gardening journey, or your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. But we had the kitchen garden, and this just so happens to be a picture that I took at Decorah during one of my visits for a camp out. This is a wonderful kitchen garden. You could walk out your door and pick all kinds of vegetables. And then we had the concept of the cottage garden, which often was planted near the house. We had lots of flowers. Again, this is from my visit to the Seed Savers Exchange, and I was just captivated by this array of hollyhocks. And hollyhocks to me just connotes an old-fashioned type of a flower. So I want to show you our kitchen garden. We now live in Hendersonville, North Carolina. After enduring the heat, the humidity, and the traffic of Raleigh, North Carolina for 28 years, we finally ended up in the western part of the state, about 20 minutes south of Asheville, and we just love it here. This is our backyard. This is our septic field. So everything is being grown in containers or straw bales above the ground. And this is what our kitchen garden looked like in mid-June of this year. We've got cucumbers and summer squash, beans and melons, eggplants, peppers, and a whole lot of tomatoes. And I'm going to throw SSC a curveball because I added a few slides to this. We submitted our talks a few weeks ago, but this is new. This is today. And so if you remember what our garden looked like, our kitchen garden on the last slide, this is what 1 month does in a warm area. I'm sure this is not a surprise. You'll actually see some stakes bending over in the back because we had a gusty thunderstorm the other night. So that's our kitchen garden, and we love it. We've been picking lots of squash and cukes and beans, and we're waiting the stars of the harvest. This is our current flower garden. So this is our cottage garden. This is right out our backyard. We can actually open the curtains to our bedroom and look out our deck and see this when we wake up in the morning. And you'll notice it's not fenced in, and neither was our garden. We have 3 dogs. So somehow we have 3 respectful rescues who do not go prowling around our garden, but they do love to eat the grass that comes out of the wheat bales. And this is the very first, very imperfect harvest of the tomato season. So all of these varieties that I just picked a few days ago have color on them because they suffered from blossom end rot, which is, of course, a very common affliction, particularly those first few tomatoes off the plant. But I tasted them all and they're delicious. Why are we going to start in the mid-1800s? This is a scan of one of the oldest seed catalogs I could find, and this is from the McMahon Seed Company of Philadelphia in 1804. American seedsmen really didn't get cranked up until the mid-1800s. So when you did see some of these catalogs, there wasn't a whole lot in them in terms of diversity of varieties. So we're going to take a walk now through these intervals that I want to study with you over the next hour. Mid-1800s. The numbers of U.S. seed companies are starting to really increase as gardeners are growing at an astounding pace. However, many of them were started off being seeded, pun intended, with European varieties. There were no hybrids to be found, of course. Everything was open-pollinated. People were saving their own seed. By the way, I do collect seed catalogs and I love to look at them. And I can tell you the ones from the mid-1800s are fairly devoid of art. There are some line drawings. Weirdly, there's very few descriptions. So people who were looking through these catalogs at the time, I don't know how they made their decisions. Maybe they liked the name. Note the prices. And some of these are hard to see, but a packet of snap beans or pole beans tended to be in the 20 to 30 cent per packet. And I'll bet you they carried a lot of seeds in those packets. The focus, of course, was in-ground gardening and farming. Let's go up 50 years to the early 1900s. We start seeing gorgeous seed catalog illustrations. And this one on the right, the Livingston from 1900, is one of my prized possessions. I found this going to just a flea market type store in the 1990s in New Hampton, New Hampshire, when I was at a chemistry conference. And I have been looking for Livingston catalogs for years. I think I paid $5 for this. But what's interesting is the cover tomato, Magnus, a potato leaf pink that was released in 1900. So I went on a mission to search far and wide for this tomato. Many people thought it was extinct, but it was hiding in the USDA collection. And Carolyn Mail and I both got samples out and ended up getting it listed in seed catalogs to where anyone can now grow this variety, Magnus. So what about the early 1900s? There was an explosion in the number of US seed companies. There were all kinds of breeding breakthroughs going on, so the number of varieties was increasing. Hybrids were often created as the start of making open-pollinated varieties. So a company would do a cross between two varieties, grow out the cross, and then spend the next 5 or 6 years selecting for something. But what they would release would be something that was stable and not a hybrid, so seeds could be saved from it. Canning started becoming important. Hence, the shape of a lot of vegetables was the breeders wanted to make them more uniform. So tomatoes, a little bit smaller, a little bit rounder, less waste. Some photos, but mostly colorful art and in-ground gardening still ruled the day. We get to the mid-1900s, and yes, there's photography in the catalogs, but to my eyes, I liked the artistic drawings much better. But here we are. We started seeing seed company consolidation. For example, Shumway is now a combination of Buckbee, which was in the same area of the country, and the Shumway Company. They consolidated and it became Shumway. This is the time of the victory gardens. Think of the mid-1900s. World War II is done. The stress was on getting back home and planting your garden. This is also when hybrids came along as seeds that you could purchase in seed catalogs, and this changed the gardening paradigm. This is the beginning of the loss of non-hybrid varieties. There's still colorful catalogs, but there's less creative art. And here's the other interesting thing. Your veggie colors were pretty standard. So your tomatoes were red, your peppers were green that ripened to red. Container gardening started becoming a thing. So let's look at today. We have it all. Um, we have many heirlooms to choose from, almost primarily due to the emergence of the Seed Savers Exchange in 1975, which reversed the trend of varieties going extinct because companies did not want to spend time developing open pollinated varieties. They wanted to sell the hybrids. There was far more diversity in terms we have today in terms of the numbers and types, of course. Seed saving becomes a common thing. We have specialized companies such as Vermont Bean Seed, and Johnny Selected Seed is big into lettuce. Pine Tree is into small packets. Southern Exposure is into heirlooms. And now we have in-ground gardening, raised bed gardening, container gardening, straw bale gardening, hydroponics. So many people um, think that we have lost a lot of our genetic heritage and that we actually are not as fortunate now as our parents and grandparents, but solely due to the formation of the Seed Savers Exchange. That trend was totally reversed. We now have lots of breeders creating new varieties, and there simply are no more fortunate gardeners in the world than we are now. However, that is being mitigated a little bit by the challenge of growing in the conditions we find ourselves in these days, but we'll leave that to another time. Here is a slide. I'm going to show this slide twice. I'm not going to talk about the left side of it, but I wanted to show a picture of Kent. Kent and Diane formed the Seed Savers Exchange in 1975. The idea of the Seed Savers Exchange changed everything. It was not formed to be a seed company. It was formed to be a mechanism to reverse the disappearance of varieties from seed catalogs, also to find a home for the varieties that were spread all over the world that were maybe being grown by one family and one little dot on the map. This gave a sharing mechanism, sharing addresses, sending mail, getting seeds transferred. So the Seed Savers Exchange, which I joined in 1986, changed not only my gardening life, but it changed my life. And as it has, whether they know it or not, changed the lives of everybody who gardens today. I wanted to show the impact of the Seed Savers Exchange in what appears to be a busy slide, but it's really not so much. So on the left are a column of common crops that I pulled out of various seed catalogs: peas and cabbage, beans and lettuce. I wanted to have this slide do several different things: pick up trends in what people were growing by different years, and also to look at, by looking at how many varieties were often in catalogs, what were the popular crops to be grown at the time. So the bottom number tells a story. First of all, I added up everything in the columns. So you had 255 different varieties in the mid 1800s, up to 567 in the early 1900s. That number dropped off precipitously in the mid 1900s, primarily due to the race to hybrids. Not today, and we'll use 1998 as an example, as well as 2019, some of the standard catalogs, such as Burpees, still focus primarily on hybrids. And adding up what they offer, the number is still pretty low. But if you look at a specialty catalog such as Johnny's, back up to 528 varieties. So that was the reversal. Mid 1900s, we're losing our varieties. Seed Savers Exchange forms. Today, the varietal number is almost out of control, insane. What if you get the Seed Saver yearbook, 10 or 12,000 different tomatoes? Let's spend just a few more minutes on this slide and look at what was grown at different years. Mid 1800s, it was all about peas. Secondarily, maybe a little about cabbage and beans. Where were tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants on the list? Way at the bottom. Early 1900s, strangely, it was all about diversity in melons that was being appreciated, as well as beans. And the mid 1900s, Beans still rule the day. Tomatoes are starting to creep up. And of course, today, tomatoes have just taken off in terms of being one of the most popular crops to grow in the garden. But there's also now tons of different lettuces and tons of different peppers. We are very, very lucky. So I like to call the Seed Saver Yearbook the Bible of Diversity, that body that contains much of our botanical history. If one were a genealogist for different varieties, this would be a great place to start. And I am very fortunate in that I've got every Seed Saver yearbook from 1975 up until today, and I've got them in a place where they're handy because I often get questions to research different varieties, and this is the place to go often to find where these varieties originated from, who was the first person to share them. So let's dig a little deeper on some crops. And I want now to have us focus on the names of different vegetables that popped up in different times because we get to see which heirloom varieties have stood the test of time to the point that we can still grow them today. So if we look at this page from a mid 1800s catalog and look at the beans, I've made a little bit of a list on the right: Valentine, horticultural, refugee, case knife, cranberry. These are still beans that have made it through that 150 plus years to where we can grow them today. Still, take a look. The prices are a little bit easier to read on this slide. And kinds, numbers 3, 12, and 13 are the earliest. So nothing in here about what color the beans are, what color the pods are, whether they're stringless or not. Let's look at beets. And there were red beets, extra early blood turnip, long blood, long smooth blood, but there were also yellows, early yellow turnip. We had a white sugar and a yellow sugar. And one of my favorite names for any vegetable in all of gardening is the mangel-wurzel, which is a very large root that is grown primarily for fodder, for livestock. It's very, very nutritious, and it looks like a big cylindrical beet that pops out of the ground. Eggplant never gets a whole lot of respect, and it really didn't back in the mid-1800s in USC catalogs because we had long purple, large purple, improved New York, which is actually a wonderful variety, and white for ornaments. This is New York improved, growing in my garden in the early 2000s, and it is just a really special eggplant. It is your eggplant parmesan type of an eggplant because you can cut those big slabs off it. Mid-1800s for lettuce. A lot of different varieties, but the ones that stood out for me are varieties that we either know from being grown by Thomas Jefferson and still available today, such as tennis ball, varieties such as brown Dutch, Cos, which is another name for romaine lettuce, and oak leaf, which is a very commonly grown leaf lettuce. If you look through that list, some of them have not made it through to now under the names that they're listed here. But that's a curious thing about heirlooms is we probably have many, many, many more heirlooms than have been developed. So varieties pick up different names over the years. Let's say there's a variety called Uncle Bob's Favorite. 20 years later, it's in a different family. People forgot what the name is. That tomato then becomes Jill's Favorite or Jill's Beauty. So we have to be really careful about tracing names and not always thinking something is gone extinct. It's just that it's now known under a different name. Mid 1800s with melons. Interestingly, we go to the store and buy cantaloupes and we cut them open and we see that salmon or orange colored flesh. In the mid 1800s, it was all about the pale green flesh, what we think of now as the color of honeydew melons. So nutmeg, Jenny Lind. The mid 1800 peppers were very, very disappointing for anyone who is a pepperhead today. We had cherry pepper, sweet Spanish, sweet mountain, small chili. Again, these names are really, really boring and they're largely descriptive. We'll see in a little while when we get into the next set of crops from the early 1900s how the names started becoming a little bit more interesting. But they did have cherry, squash, bell, and cayenne even back then. But there were no habaneros, there were no Anaheims, a lot of the varieties that people love to grow today. So now we're going to stop on tomatoes. And this is kind of a stunning slide. This is an 1840 Breck company seed catalog. Breck was a seed catalog in Massachusetts. And, above the word tomato were a lot of squash, and there were about 30 different types. Below tomato is turnip, and there were about 20 different types. Or you could buy tomato seed, no description, one variety. We in America really considered the tomato poisonous to eat until we started getting into the mid 1800s and beyond. Hence, people were probably growing this for an ornamental. This is a really nice cut from a mid 1800 catalog that shows what tomatoes looked like back then when there were very few types available. So that number one is called Mammoth Chihuahua. And it did not carry through to today under that name, but it looks an awful lot like the big, lumpy, ugly heirloom types that we grow. It's really nice when you come upon lithographs. This is a Benary lithograph from 1876, and it shows the red cherry tomato, the yellow cherry tomato, the little pear tomato, but it also shows how creased and ugly tomatoes were at that time. Breeders had not been looking to smoothing them out for canning. There was a lot of waste and a lot of rot. And if you look at some of the descriptions of the flavors of some of these early tomatoes, they weren't particularly good. Puffy, hollowness, watery. And I can't really talk about this slide all that much yet, except that it is part of a mystery um, that occurred at Monticello that I was in contact with people there about. So I actually call this Monticello mystery tomato. But if you look, I grew this back in my garden, and I'm growing 2 plants of it this year. But that green tomato back there really, really looks like the tomatoes that were being sold in American seed catalogs in the mid 1800s. So a typical page would be, listen to these just incredibly enticing descriptions: extra early red, large smooth red, dwarf red, mammoth, large yellow. Not a lot of creativity. However, there are two tomatoes of note on this slide. The cook's favorite, which is thought to be extinct. Fiji Island, and Fiji was described in some catalogs as a very large, irregular pink tomato that may have ended up from the Bahamas or from the south into North Carolina. And I wonder if the variety German Johnson, which is considered a North Carolina heirloom, could be a descendant of Fiji. Just a little speculation that I have. We can never know for sure because Fiji is extinct and we don't have the seeds of it to be able to test DNA. A lot of us, I'm sure, on this meeting love flowers. And when you look at the mid 1800 catalogs, you would find lots of pages of artists who would take their time to draw the most beautiful flowers. And look at some of the names of what were the most popular flowers at the time: asters, balsam, which is very, very rarely grown now, dianthus, petunias, but the numbers of color choices were much more limited than today. Phlox, sweet williams, cottage gardeny, old-fashioned names, stocks, hollyhocks, mignonette, which is a flower that people used to grow in their window boxes because it smelled so good, and maybe the street smells were not so good. So they wanted to get something nice growing in front of the windows. Sweet peas were huge. Pansy and coxcomb, which is a form of celosia that looks like it has a rooster head. How boring, huh? Mid 1800 typical flower page, lots of scientific names, no descriptions whatsoever. So I'm really not sure how seed companies sold a lot of flower seeds with pages like this. Let's move up 50 years. Early 1900s, wax beans joined the fray. They became really popular to grow. If we look at early 1900 beets, we have varieties we can grow today showing up: Crosby's Egyptian, Detroit dark red, but still a very, very, very heavy emphasis on red beets. Early 1900s with eggplant, we have New York improved and we have Black Beauty. We have no other color of eggplant or other shape whatsoever. In terms of lettuces, we are now seeing butterheads and icebergs and Koss, of course. However, it is all about green. The lettuces were green. So even though we now have heirloom lettuces that were different colors going way back into the 1800s, they're not varieties that ended up in United States seed catalogs. They were just passed from family to family, farm to farm. Early 1900 with melons, now the salmon flesh melons have ascended over the pale green flesh to become more popular. There's a variety called Emerald Gem that's on the left page toward the bottom. And Burpee released this. It is dark green on the outside, but it has salmon flesh on the inside. And I would like to grow that someday. We have the variety Rocky Ford, also known as Netted Gem, or Eden's Gem, which I have growing in my garden this year. And I look forward to seeing what that's like. That will be a green fleshed melon. So I want to bring this picture back again to show the picture on the left, moon and stars. And even though this is 1924, I think we can fit this into the early 1900s. So I remember going to a farmer's market in Raleigh and seeing stalls filled with moon and stars melons. And the reason that they're there is because Kent put out an SOS for anyone growing this melon, which was thought to be extinct. And someone who lived mere miles from his house had a field of them. Kent went and visited, convinced them to make the seeds available. And now we can all grow it. But it turns out it dates back to the Henderson Seed Company as a novelty that they released in 1924 that we can grow today. For early 1900 peppers, we had Chinese Giant, Ruby King, which is also known as World Beater. But now the peppers are starting to get big and blocky and bell-shaped. If you look at the list on the left, we have a Golden Dawn, we have a Golden Queen. So some colors are starting to appear. And for hot peppers, we had Bird's Eye and Tabasco. There's World Beater pepper, one of my favorite green ripening to red bell peppers growing in one of my gardens in Raleigh. This is a great picture. This is in one of the early Livingston seed catalogs where he wanted to lay out all of his releases in a row showing their true colors. So in this array, and the date of introduction is superimposed on the tomato. So note the smooth shape. The size is not monstrous. So when we grow a mortgage lifter, one of these big, huge tomatoes, this is not what people were growing in their garden in the early 1900s. They were going for medium-sized fruit that they could can. But we have we have yellow, we have pink, like a peachy color, we have yellows, we have reds, but we don't have the chocolates. We don't have the dark flesh tomatoes yet. This list shows all of Livingston's key releases from 1870 up to 1908. So Livingston was the person who realized that to improve a tomato, you don't just look at a plant and save seeds from a perfect fruit on that plant. All of the genetic material in every seed on a stable variety is going to be the same. And he wondered why seed companies were failing to improve the tomato. So what he did was he would pick a variety and plant out a field of it, and then look for the one or two plants that was distinctly different and distinctly better. That would be the start of his selection process. And by doing that, he released all of these fascinating sound tomatoes. So he canned the large red and the big pink, and he went for, tomato names that inferred superiority: Paragon, Acme, Perfection, Golden Queen, Favorite. Really interesting how tomatoes get named. Every now and then, I would go through the USDA collection and find a tomato with a funny name and not knowing anything about its history. So I requested a sample of Ferris wheel. I grew it and loved it. And then I found out that it was released in 1894 by the Salzer Seed Company. I sent it to lots of seed companies and listed it through the Seed Savers yearbook, and a lot of us can now grow it. And here it is growing in my Raleigh garden, a big 1 to 1.25 pound beefsteak, thriving in the heat and humidity in Raleigh with a superior flavor. So this is something that I love to do, is rescue things that are nearing their demise and get them out to the public again. Early 1900 flowers. What is new here? Well, we still had our asters. We have carnations are becoming popular. But but many of these are the same, except for I wanted you to note sweet peas. A lot of the flowers were coming over from Europe and being sold in our companies, and that dictated a lot of the early taste. Sweet peas were huge in the UK, but what I loved about some of these early 1900 seed catalogs is you can often buy separate colors of almost every flower. Sweet peas in this Burpee catalog I looked at, you could get 115 different sweet peas, all separated into colors so that you could buy 10 different blues, 10 different lavenders, 15 different pinks. Seed companies apparently thought that that was a lot of work and a lot of cost, and most of the times now all we can buy are mixes, which is a little bit sad. Let's flip to the mid 1900s. So I was born in 1956, so we're getting into my territory. My interest in gardening was hugely influenced by this book Jim Crockett wrote, The Victory Garden, which is also tied in with a very influential PBS show called Crockett's Victory Garden. Catalogs started getting really boring, packed with information, black and white pictures. The move now is to bush beans from pole beans, and they're starting to really focus on varieties that were stringless so that you didn't end up flossing your teeth in the middle of your meal. Anybody who's taken a bite of a bean with a strong string in it, it's not all that pleasant. For beets, red strongly predominates still in the mid 1900s. Crosby's Egyptian, Detroit dark red, many of the same varieties. Let's look at eggplant, New York spineless, Black Beauty. None of the Asian types, none of the slender types, none of the pinks and whites and stripes. Mid 1900s with lettuce, we see black-seeded Simpson, Grand Rapids. These are leaf lettuces that are popular today, Slowbolt. But they're all green once more. As far as mid 1900s melons, they're almost entirely your typical cantaloupe that you get today. So, and the numbers of varieties offered was greatly reduced. One of the reasons that a lot of our melons, our heirloom melons from the mid 1800s and up, haven't come through is because, unlike tomatoes and peppers and eggplant, they're not perfect flowered. You need cross pollination from male to female to get your melon. So a lot of the varieties, I'm sure, that were released way back then have, they call it run out or become crossed through little bee experiments, and we may not have them today. So it's much more rare to have a cantaloupe or a watermelon or a squash that was growing in the mid 1800s than it is to have a tomato or a pepper or an eggplant. Speaking of peppers, Hungarian wax featured here, as well as Golden California Wonder. There's World Beater, there's Ruby King, but still not a whole lot of excitement about peppers. This is the slide. This is the turning point. Burpee released Big Boy in 1949. That changed everything. That was the first hybrid tomato variety that was sown in a seed catalog. When you grow a Big Boy and run out of seeds, you have to go back to Burpee. Whereas all of these other seed companies selling open pollinated, once people got their seed, they could just save their own seed. So this started companies, breeding programs, releasing hybrids in catalogs. This single page probably started leading to the demise of varieties that Kent and Diane noted when they started cataloging varieties just before they started the Seed Savers Exchange, which reversed that trend. As far as flowers, this is one of my favorite flower books. Again, James Crockett wrote it, and poof, popping off the page are all these colors where snapdragons are becoming popular and impatiens are becoming popular, even though that is misspelled. It is not impatient. The T does not belong there. More mixes, less separate colors. So my favorite part, we skip to today. We have beans, hundreds and hundreds of varieties. The Seed Savers has been so intimately involved in maintaining and saving a lot of these varieties, the Wanigan Project. And if you look through the great book, Seed Savers Exchange, 1975 to 1985, you see all of these pictures at past conferences where people come and talk about their huge bean collection. And, the pod colors are one thing, but it really is the seed colors and the stories associated. Look what we get to grow with beets. And so those who garden now, chefs, must be so excited about the color palette of pretty much every vegetable that they get to play with and creatively cook them. Striped, white, gold, diversity is increasing. Eggplants now, we have greens and whites and pinks with blushes. These are all just some that I just bred by dehybridizing Orient Express. Lettuces. We have microgreen lettuces. We have blood red, dark magentas. These two varieties shown here are two of my favorites, magenta and Cherokee. Melons, because of a lot of Amy Goldman's work and Glenn Drown's work, a lot of the melons of yesterday have been brought forward and joined by a lot of newer varieties. So you go to a produce section at a farmer's market and the sky is the limit. We're just so lucky. Peppers. Name your heat level, name your shape, name your color, name your size, and you can grow it. And I think people have now really embraced peppers as a crop to eat in so many different ways. With tomatoes, we have it all because we have a lot of Livingston's varieties plus what we have today. We have so much diversity. And with flowers today, we have less separate colors. We have more mixes. I think, though, the gardens today, it's all about petunias and impatiens and different colored vincas and different colored marigolds. I have tended to now go to, my wife and I have really developed a love of perennial flowers. So we're planting less packets. We also don't like the fact that to buy any of these fancy perennials is costing you $20 or $30 for one plant. So we like to look for companies that sell mixes of perennial seeds and start our own and populate our garden with those. So now we'll slow down a little bit toward the end here and look at some really interesting, quaint things from catalogs. Once you start going through old seed catalogs, you're captivated because number one, you're looking at pages that your great grandparents, your grandparents, and your grandparents may have flipped through. You're looking at the state of gardening when they were gardening, and you end up with a page like this from an 1868 Vic's Floral Guide. Great name, right? So, gossip with customers. Now, I'm just going to read a few sentences out of this first paragraph. Another season has passed away, and with it all the floral beauties that made summer and autumn so attractive. In place of the green lawn, illuminated with gay flowers, we have the pure, cold, lifeless snow. Instead of gentle zephyrs laden with the delicious fragrance of a thousand blossoms, the blasts of the winter storm. How can you not love that? So, there is a site, I'm going to have to make sure I share the link of this. The Gilbert Library, the government funds this, where they have digitized somewhere around 70,000 seed catalogs. I collected a lot, so I have many, many in paper copy, but you can just go on and put in a year or put in a company and peruse each of these catalogs and flip through the pages, and you can blow it up so you can read it. Some of you may still be reading on to this just incredibly emotional treatise that this person wrote. Then we get to hyperbole, we get to exaggeration. So when you have artists creating the pictures for your catalogs, and when you're in a very competitive business, because when the seed companies started booming in the mid 1800s, there were lots of them. How do you draw attention to the products that you're trying to sell in your seed catalog? Well, by drawing a catalog that looks like, by drawing a cabbage that looks a bit like, I don't know, a geodesic dome and a stilt where you gather a bunch of admirers standing around it. What does that little sign say? The most wonderful cabbage in the world. 9,990 heads out of 10,000. 10,000 heads per acre at 5 cents. You have a little elf standing on the top and climbing a ladder. So you see a lot of this. So what do we do today for catalogs to try to create hyperbole? Is we take glamour shots of our produce and we adjust the colors. If we're selling flowers, not we as us on this call, But seed companies, we adjust the colors so that the blue of the flower that we're trying to encourage people to buy is much bluer than what it would look like in real life, et cetera, et cetera. The tomatoes are all perfect. The tomatoes are all shiny. Um, we have photography. We also have social networking. So I would be willing to bet that there are a lot of garden variety influencers, whether they know it or not. So I know that I get onto Instagram Live every week and show my garden, and I've started to become cognizant of the fact that if I'm growing X, Y, or Z and start talking about it, then people are going to go out and look for it. So we have to be aware of the influential power that some of us have if we use social networking to teach and share our gardening experiences. This is a whole page for one tomato in the 1904 mall. And I will say, I actually found this tomato in the USDA collection, requested a sample, and grew it. It is neither enormous nor is it absolutely wonderful. However, I have to realize that this tomato came out in 1904. I requested the seed in right around early 2000s, and it could be that it become crossed up or genetically changed in the interim. But look what they did here. We have a yardstick on the top. We have 8 to the yard. We have a woman at the bottom in front of her table, and her sign says 7 of our enormous tomatoes make a yard. And somebody just spent an incredible amount of time writing text for this one tomato. Why? Because the mall seed company really wanted to bring it to attention. Often companies back then would have contests. So if they would develop a new variety, they would say $50 to the person who comes up with the best name of our new tomato. And they would send 20 or 30 test packets out, and people would grow the tomatoes and sometimes even send in samples, because there would also be who can grow the largest tomato contest. It was really interesting looking for those types of pages. Perfection is possible with drawing. So we get this guy sitting on his wagon covered with stocked up with cabbages, and I assume that must be a paved road because any bump is going to drop all those cabbages off the carriage. And look at the field behind him. Perfect rows. I don't even know how you would step into that field to pick the cabbages, but this is what went on back then. And all of our tomato plants look like this, right? That one on the left, this is from a 1904 Salzer seed catalog. And this is a picture of his giant tree tomato. And the farmer is looking up at the archway of this plant that must have 101-pound tomatoes. Well, seeing is believing. Lacrosse seedling with the cutout there, you actually have a plant that has more tomatoes than foliage on it. So here's something else that's kind of interesting is when you start looking through these catalogs and look at the descriptions, almost every description says, this is the best tomato you can grow for your garden. So I'm sure they were aware that they had inconsistencies with their text, but they just wanted every place that your eye hit the page, you would think that you're growing the best tomato that you can possibly can. Now let's talk about pricing just briefly, because we all who garden now, who um, use seed catalogs to buy some of our varieties, are aware of the pressures on seed companies. COVID just made gardening explode, and so seed companies had to try to keep up with the demand. Postage has increased, labor has increased, and seed prices have increased. I've seen some seed catalogs where certain hybrid tomatoes, $20, $30 for 10 seeds. So we all get to choose what we want to grow. Because I've been in the Seed Savers Exchange since 1986, I've amassed, I would say, a fairly huge collection of varieties, to the point where I rarely use seed catalogs anymore. But people actually, I wouldn't say they use me as a seed catalog, but when I grow lots of a variety, I'm really happy to share it out. So in a way, I'm a little bit like a no charge free seed catalog to try to get interesting things into people's gardens. So look at this, the great dollar collection of earliest vegetables. 35 packages of the earliest and best vegetable novelties post-paid for $1. Below that, 18 magnificent northern grown late vegetables are a 50-cent collection. So, people were growing their food, they were farming, and the seed companies clearly partnered with people. I'm sure they were profitable, but this kind of worked out where people could actually afford the seeds that they grow. I like pictures like this in older seed catalogs because this would give you a little peek into what was going on farms and in homes where people gardened in the early 1900s. And, people were sitting and doing their crafts or they were having lunch. This was clearly a farm where you've got, it looks like baskets of tomatoes sitting in front, probably bushel baskets, and baskets of cantaloupe. And whether this was a farm stand or not, maybe this was just break time and people were loading up to take to market. But I'm kind of a person who really tends towards a love of history, a love of genealogy. And if you like that sort of thing, um, flipping through seed catalogs after a long day of battling foliage disease on your tomatoes or tomato hornworm or awful weather, sometimes this is a really nice uh, way to refocus and recenter yourself. And we're going to end this journey through what's gone on in this country from the mid 1800s to where we are now, just taking a look at this nostalgic picture, which was listed in a Thorburn seed catalog. You can picture the store in New York City in the late 1800s, where you would actually have a store with nothing but packets of seeds and big bins of seeds on all of the shelves, people working in front to pack up orders to put onto the horse-pulled wagon to take to farms. So this, I really love to look at pictures like this. So back to a little nostalgia. Where did my love of history come from, and where did my love of gardening come from? Well, it came from my maternal grandfather, Walter Gibbs, who is the gentleman on the left, and he and my grandmother, his wife Elsie, were at their 50th wedding anniversary when this picture was taken. And that's my dad, Wilfred, who is taking me to Slater Park in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and he's telling me the names of all of the flowers that are growing in the gardens there. These look like stocks, actually. And then my own first garden was in 1962. And looking through a lot of those mid 1900 Burpee seed catalogs, I remember them because my father used to get them in the mail and he would enter the try to grow a white marigold contest and things like that. So I'm very lucky that I had a grandfather and a father who instilled the love of gardening to me early on in my life and started the gardening journey that continues unabated to this day. So all of you really have a job, and that is to grow your own gardener, whether it's your children or nieces or nephews, neighbors, relatives. I'm sure many of you have wondrous gardens that are filled with heirloom varieties that have stories associated with them. So that's the hook. Bring people in, give them a taste of something. Maybe they're growing Cherokee Purple, which is a tomato that, of course, is near and dear to me. So I don't know how many times I've told the Cherokee Purple story and the role that I get to play in naming it and helping to popularize it. But that tomato was released in 1990, and here it is 2023. And in Hendersonville, I've done tastings where people have no idea about Cherokee Purple. They still think, a tomato is made in the back room of a grocery store and they're all red and they're all supposed to taste like cardboard. So you can entice people with the stories, and you can also build community with stories and get people working together. If anybody's interested in these books, this is a 2-second ad, and I'm not even going to talking about selling them. I'm just going to say these are the 2 books I've written, and I have an exciting phone call coming up with my editor at Story in a few days, and we're going to talk about maybe a 3rd book coming out. But if you're interested in getting signed copies, you can just email me. CraigLeHoullier.com is my blog. I'm a frequent blogger. I have a frequently asked questions section. I'm not too good at capturing speaking events these days because primarily I'm not traveling to give talks. COVID has encouraged me to stay home, use a lot of Zoom, and nctomatoman@gmail.com gets emailed to me. From about mid-March to September, I sit in my backyard with Instagram Live on, and I do a little show for 45 minutes where I do show and tell some stories, share my disasters, show people my early blight, my septorial leaf spot, and then just take questions for about 20 minutes. And all of these that I've done for the last 4 years are sitting in my Instagram profile, which is at NC Tomato Man, on the center tab, which is for videos. And I actually do have an online tomato course that I've done with Joe Lample. If you're interested, you can look at Joe Lample's online gardening academy. And I think we are done. So I hope that that journey was interesting to you in terms of giving you some perspective and context of where we've been when gardening first really became popular in the US and seed catalogs started creating lots of interesting varieties, and where we find ourselves now as the luckiest gardeners ever with the ability to grow an infinite variety and to share them with like-minded people. And any questions that this talk elicited, I am very happy to answer. So thank you very much.
Craig, thank you so much. You just answered my question, which was when would you want to live in gardening history? But it sounds like we've got it the best right now, huh?
We have it the absolute best right now, and I'm trying to decide. I guess that is the window that I go to. Are
Yeah,
we good?
that sounds
Okay.
good. Um, I'll just go ahead and bring it to us. I invite anybody watching to put some questions in the chat. We had a couple come through that we'll start with,
Yeah.
but if you have something, we've got about 8 minutes for question and answer. So audience, if you'd like to put something in the chat for Craig to acknowledge and answer, go ahead and do that now. We do have a question from Charlie. He'd love to learn more about the septic tank issues and perhaps straw bale ideas. Could you chat just a little bit
Yeah,
more
yeah,
about that?
yeah. So I fell in love with straw bale gardening when Story asked me to write a book about straw bale gardening, and I said to them, I would love to, but I need to learn about it first. So in Raleigh, I lived next to a sheriff who was known as the straw bale gardener of Raleigh, and he shared a lot of the techniques with me. I read some of the existing books. But I wanted to make it my book. So I wanted to talk about what can go well and what cannot go well. And with straw bale gardening, very little can go wrong. It is a wonderful way to take a straw bale and turn it into a perfect loamy environment for your plants to grow in. I tend to average about 30 pounds of tomatoes per plant, 2 plants per straw bale. So a minimum of 60 pounds of tomatoes per straw bale for my indeterminate heirloom varieties. You're starting clean. So if you're growing some maybe disease sensitive heirlooms, you're starting in the best spot. I actually wrote, so there's my book about it, but I also wrote an article for Gardener Supply about straw bale gardening that I can send anyone the link to. Maybe we can, post it against my talk. Um, you buy a straw bale and you start treating it with nitrogen alternate days for a week, watering it every day. Then you hit it with a balanced fertilizer. 2 weeks from the time you start the process, you can then plant into it. You just create a little crevice, plant in your seedling. You don't add any other dirt. But like container gardening, you're watering and feeding more regularly because it's hot and you have all of the sides of that bale for the sun to draw water out of, and every time you water, you're going to leach nutrients away. So it's a little bit of a labor intensive. However, you're elevating it. And so when you're picking your green beans, you can sit in your chair and pick them, um, rather than spend any more time on it because our septic field is back there. We can't dig a garden. Straw bale and container gardening allow us to take advantage of the full sun location by growing on top of that soil. Doesn't hurt the septic system at all, and we end up harvesting a ton of produce from our backyard and have very, very happy neighbors. So
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
yeah.
We have another question from Leticia that says, recently the Nobel Prize nominated a GMO Brazilian leader. How can we improve popular knowledge for the matter? Do you have any 2 cents on this, Craig?
Well, so GMO, which I like to refer more to GE, and the reason I do that is because we are genetically modified organisms. Once our parents did what they did and we came along, we are a mixture of their genes. So almost all new tomatoes come from genetically modifying them through traditional breeding techniques. Genetic engineering is a very controversial topic with many, many people on both sides of the aisle. Being one who loves heirlooms, and I'm a scientist, I've got a PhD in chemistry, I understand the science behind it. My concern is that we don't know some of the butterfly effects of what happens to the pollinators if they take pollen from a genetically engineered organism. What are the changes 5 or 10 years down the line? So I'm not going to say anything more than that, but knowledge is what we need, and we need to talk to each other. But what we need is knowledge that is not necessarily being heavily funded by one or the other side of the discussion. We want truth. We want real information. I would like for no one with true vested interest in profiting off either plus or minus to be involved. But that, I know that's la la land. That's not the way it is in the world right now. So it's up to us to sort through all of the information. It's like, do you spray your garden? I'm not going to tell you what to do. I will tell people what I do, but I will tell people to go educate yourself, read as much as you can, then decide what is your own philosophical way to garden. These are tricky. That was a great, tricky question. I hope I danced through that well enough.
I think you did. Another question, and this will be probably our last one. I'd love to learn more about those historic melons. I'd love to see more of those and start to grow and promote them here. And there were a couple people in the chat
Yeah.
interested in historic melons. Can you give us some resources?
What I'm looking at right here is what it may take me a little too long to find. So I would say email me at nctomatoman@gmail.com and I will send you the link to all of the seed catalogs. I would say buy Amy Goldman's book because I think that is the absolute best book on documentation of historic melons and what's available. But the link that I'll send you to the Gilbert Library, you can pick any year in any company and just start looking at what was around and then looking at and then you start Googling names and seeing if that is still in existence. I mean, Glenn Drowns was wonderful at finding melons that are on the verge of extinction and bringing them back to reality. Tomatoes are kind of my major thing, but I love to grow everything. So if anybody wants to engage me in some of these discussions, just get in touch and we'll have that conversation. But I want to make sure SSC can somehow post that link to the 70,000 seed catalog scans where everyone can take a look at them and use them as a resource. But they're all great questions. And again, thank you all for putting up with me for an hour, going through one of my obsessions, which is gardening history.
Wonderful. Craig, maybe you can send me that link and I'll be happy to post it, or you can post it
Great.
on the wall
I will.
in the main conference area. So
Yes.
for everyone watching, that's when you go back to the main screen of the conference, you can click the wall button on the side menu,
Mm.
and that'll bring you up to it's similar to a social media posting wall, and we'll all be able to see
Yep.
those resources there.
Yeah, and I
Wonderful.
do want, and I do want to, if people have gardening questions, I really like to be just a resource to help folks. And I do share my disease. I just have a picture of blossom end rot tomatoes on Instagram because it happens. And people are like, I feel so much better now because the guy who wrote the tomato book has problems. Anybody who gardens has problems. Anybody who thinks that gardening goes perfectly, no, that's not the way it goes. So we're all in this together. Let's help each other.
I love it. Thank you, Craig. One last question. Is it
Mm,
okay with you if we share these slides with our community?
sure.
Wonderful. We had a request for that. So we will put a link to a PDF of Craig's slide in the chat here, and we can also post those on the wall as well. So, and that did include a slide with the link to the gardening class that we had a request for in the chat, and
Mhm.
additionally, Craig's email addresses in there too. So you'll
Good.
have plenty of ways to connect with him in
Mm,
addition to connecting on the conference platform. So
yes.
thank you again for being part of the Seed Savers Exchange Seed the Future, Grow Something Good conference. And
Mm.
we hope this was a great first session for everyone. We had over 100 viewers today at this. So yay! Kicking off a great couple days of learning. And
Right.
again, Craig, thank you so much for being here.
Bye, everybody, and thank you, Kristen. I loved it. Take care.
Take care. The next session will start at in 15 minutes at 11:15 Central Time. So we'll see you all there.